In the fall of 1961, on a gravel road outside of Kiowa, Colorado, a 38-year-old woman named Nadine Pratt paid $62 for 12 bareroot apple trees that the nursery in Pueblo was going to burn. The trees were a problem. The Hendersons, who had ordered them from a catalog out of Ohio, had driven up in September expecting 12 Cortland apple trees suitable for the high plains, and found instead 12 Honeycrisp seedlings that a purchasing clerk in Columbus had shipped by mistake. Of course, the Hendersons did not want Honeycrisp. Nobody on the eastern slope of Colorado wanted Honeycrisp in 1961. The variety was experimental. It had been developed up in Minnesota, bred for cold, and nobody had proven it would perform at 5,400 feet in a county where the wind came down off the Rockies in October and the last frost could arrive in late May. The nursery manager told the Hendersons he would replace the order at no charge. He told them he would dispose of the wrong trees himself. He meant burn them. You could not just leave 12 Honeycrisp seedlings sitting in the lot through a Colorado winter and expect to sell them in the spring. They would either freeze or they would not. And either way, nobody in Elbert County was going to buy them. Nadine heard about the trees from her neighbor, Cora Finch, who had heard about it from her husband, who had stopped at the nursery in Pueblo for fencing supplies, and overheard the manager on the telephone with the Henderson account. Cora mentioned it at the church potluck on a Sunday as a piece of general interest. Most of the women at the potluck nodded and moved on to other subjects. Nadine set down her fork. She drove to Pueblo on Tuesday morning. The nursery manager, a heavy-set man named Gerald, met her at the loading dock with the expression of a person who had already decided the problem was solved and did not want to revisit it. She told him what she wanted. He looked at her the way men in the nursery business looked at women who came in alone asking questions in 1961. She was wearing work boots and a canvas jacket. She had driven 90 minutes on a 2-lane road to ask about trees he was planning to burn. He could not tell if she was serious. You want all 12 of them. I want to look at them first. He took her to the cold storage bay where the trees were bundled in damp burlap. She unwrapped each one. She looked at the root structure. She looked at the caliper of the trunk. She looked at the graft unions where the Honeycrisp cian met the rootstock. 4 of them had poor graft unions, the kind that would fail in the first hard freeze. She set those aside. The other 8 were sound. "I'll take the 8 sound ones," she said. "I will give you $62 for all 12, and you keep the 62 either way. The 4 bad ones are yours to burn. At least you are not burning the good ones." Gerald looked at the 8 trees she had lined up. He had not expected her to know what a graft union was. "You understand, these have never been grown at your elevation." "I understand that. Nobody has tried it up there. 300 and I know. What makes you think they will grow? We will tell you if they do." $40 on. He took the $62. She loaded the 8 trees herself into the bed of her truck, wrapped in the burlap they had come in, and drove back to Kiowa. Her husband, a quiet man named Warren Pratt, who ran a small cow-calf operation on their 280-acre property, was standing by the barn when she pulled in. He watched her unload the trees with the particular silence of a man who had been married long enough to know that some questions were better asked after the fact. He asked it anyway. "Those apple trees?" 8 of them. "Apple trees need water." "I know they need water." "Do not have extra water." "I know what we have, Warren." Looked at the trees lined up against the barn wall. He was not a man who argued. He was a man who observed. He had been observing Nadine Pratt for 16 years, and he had learned that when she got a particular set to her jaw, the jaw she had right now, The conversation was not really a conversation. It was a notification. $40. Where are you putting them? The south slope below the windbreak. Warren looked at the south slope. He thought about the soil down there, the clay content, the drainage. He thought about the late frosts that came rolling off the mountains some years well into May, and how an apple tree in bloom on the south slope in late April was a risk nobody in their right mind would take. He did not say any of this. 300, he helped her carry the trees to the south slope. 40 By the end of that week, Elbert County had something to talk about. Nadine Pratt bought 12 experimental apple trees from a nursery in Pueblo, trees developed in Minnesota that nobody had proven would grow at high altitude, going to plant them on a cattle ranch in Kiowa. The story moved the way all stories move in small Colorado communities, from the feed store in Kiowa to the grain elevator in Elizabeth, from the Elizabeth elevator to the Elbert County Fair Committee. And at every stop, the story got a little more confusing, because Nadine Pratt was not the kind of person Elbert County expected to be planting experimental fruit trees. Let me tell you about Nadine Pratt, because what she did on that south slope over the next 20 years only makes sense if you understand where the idea came from. Nadine was born in 1923 in Fountain, Colorado, the second of 4 children of a man named Howard Goss, who ran a small market garden on the outskirts of town and sold vegetables at the Colorado Springs Farmers Market twice a week from April through October. Howard Goss was not a conventional market gardener. He did not grow what the other vendors grew. He grew unusual varieties, heirloom strains he had tracked down through seed catalogs from Vermont and Pennsylvania. A German butterball potato he had sourced from a grower in Wisconsin. A dry-farmed tomato he had read about in a letter published in a small agricultural journal out of California. He corresponded with growers in 6 states. He kept records of everything: soil temperature, germination rate, days to maturity, yield per row foot, flavor notes written in a ledger that Nadine still had in 1961, sitting in the 3rd drawer of her kitchen desk. Howard believed that the high altitude and the temperature swings of the Colorado Front Range were not a liability. He believed they were an advantage. The cold nights, the intense sun, the dry air, $100 on. He had read papers from growers in the Swiss Alps, from market gardeners in the highlands of Chile, from orchardists in the upper Rhone Valley in France, growing fruit and vegetables in conditions that American agricultural extension agents said were too harsh, too cold, too unpredictable. Every one of those growers had figured out that the stress of altitude and temperature swing did not destroy flavor. It concentrated it. It pushed sugar content into fruit that a lowland grower could not match at any price. Goss died in 1949 when Nadine was 26. She had already been married to Warren for 3 years and moved to the ranch in Kiowa. She inherited her father's ledgers, his seed catalogs, his correspondence files, and a specific way of seeing agricultural problems that most people in Elbert County did not share and would not have recognized as useful. 4 years. She had been thinking about apples for 4 years before Gerald at the nursery in Pueblo decided to burn 12 Honeycrisp seedlings. Or, here is what Nadine knew that nobody else in Elbert County was thinking about. Honeycrisp had been developed specifically to handle cold. Its entire genetic history was built around tolerance for temperature extremes, late frosts, short growing seasons. It was not a lowland apple. It was not a grocery store apple bred for shipping and shelf life and uniform appearance. It was an apple bred by plant scientists at the University of Minnesota for exactly the conditions that made Colorado Front Range orchardists give up and go back to raising cattle and the flavor. She had read the trial reports from Minnesota, the evaluations from experimental orchards in Wisconsin and Michigan, the sugar-acid balance, the texture that held through storage. This was not a novelty variety. $14. This was something being suppressed by commercial distribution networks that needed apples that could be picked green and gassed with ethylene and shipped 3,000 miles and still look acceptable in a bin at a grocery chain in New Jersey. Goss had spent 30 years telling anyone who would listen that the best growing conditions and the commercial distribution system were pointing in opposite directions and always would be. Nadine had been listening for 20 of those 30 years. She planted the 8 trees on the south slope below the windbreak in October of 1961. She amended the soil with compost she had been building for 2 years from the cattle operation's manure and the kitchen scraps and the grass clippings from a half-acre she kept specifically for the purpose. She built small earthen berms around each tree to catch the snowmelt in spring. She drove T-posts and strung wire to extend the windbreak protection 6 feet further south than it had previously reached. $1,400 on. Warren watched all of this without comment. He was a man who had decided in year 3 of his marriage that watching Nadine work was more educational than questioning her. And he had not revised that assessment in the years since. Details on. The neighbors had opinions. The man who ran the feed store in Kiowa, a person named Phil, who had been selling cattle and horse supplies in Elbert County for 20 years, told 3 customers in 1 week that Nadine Pratt's apple trees would be dead by February. He did not say it meanly. He said it as an agricultural fact. The altitude was wrong. The soil was wrong. The water situation was wrong. Phil was not wrong about any of these things individually. He was wrong about what they added up to. Many of the 8 trees did not make it through the first winter. They died the way grafted trees die, when the graft union cannot tolerate the freeze, cleanly, without drama, just dead wood in April, where live wood had been in October. Nadine pulled them and composted them and had 5 trees in the ground by spring. The other 5 leafed out in May. She did not tell anyone. She spent the first 3 summers learning what the trees needed in her specific conditions. She learned that they wanted less water than she had expected, that the clay subsoil held moisture in a way that sandy lowland soil did not, and that overwatering in July caused root problems that showed up as leaf curl in August. She learned that the windbreak she had extended gave adequate protection except from the northwest, where a gap in the old cottonwoods let the October wind come through at an angle she had not accounted for. She built a secondary windbreak with a row of Russian olive trees along that northwest edge, which Phil at the feed store found funny in a way that suggested he had given up trying to predict what Nadine Pratt was going to do next. She learned that the altitude did exactly what her father's research had said it would do. The cold nights of the Colorado summer, dropping into the 40s even in July, slowed the ripening process. The trees took longer to bring fruit to maturity than a lowland orchard would, but the flavor that developed in that slow ripening, in those cool nights and bright days at 500 and 400 feet, was not what Phil's agricultural common sense predicted. It was not marginal. It was extraordinary. In the fall of 1965, 4 years after she had paid $62 for trees a nursery was about to burn, Nadine Pratt picked the first commercial apple crop from her 5 trees, 31 pounds from 3 of the trees that were old enough to bear. She boxed them herself in the kitchen, in half-peck paper bags she had ordered from a supply company in Denver. She drove them to a restaurant in Colorado Springs that she had read about in a magazine, a place that was beginning to source local food in a way that was unusual in Colorado in 1965. The chef there was a young woman named Patricia, who had trained in New York and come back to Colorado because she had grown up in Manitou Springs and missed the mountains in a way that New York could not fix. Patricia bought all 31 pounds at a price that was 3 times what the grocery distributor had offered Nadine the week before. And then Patricia called her back 2 days later to say that her customers had been asking about the apples by name, and she wanted everything Nadine could grow. Everything. In 1965, that was 31 pounds. Nadine did not tell Patricia that. She expanded the orchard. She ordered 12 more Honeycrisp trees in the spring of 1966, this time through a proper nursery channel, and planted them on the south slope alongside the original 5 survivors. She ordered another 20 in 1968. By 1970, she had 31 producing trees. On 6 acres of the south slope she had converted from dry land pasture, and she was selling every pound she grew to 3 restaurants in Colorado Springs and 1 in Denver, at prices that made the Elbert County feed store conversations stop being funny. Warren said nothing about any of this. He helped with the harvest. He helped with the irrigation repair in the summer of 1969 when a line failed and they lost 2 weeks of water to the east section. He carried boxes. He drove the truck. He was a man who had understood something important on that first afternoon when he watched Nadine unload the trees by the barn. That his job in this particular enterprise was to make it possible, not to direct it. The word got around. Not the way the joke had gotten around in 1961. That had traveled fast and light. This was different. This was chefs in Colorado Springs talking to chefs in Denver and food writers beginning to appear in eastern Elbert County, a thing that had never happened before in the agricultural history of the county, asking to see an orchard that was doing something the Extension Service had told everyone for 40 years was impossible. Nadine was polite to all of them. She showed them the trees. She showed them the soil amendments. She explained the windbreak construction, the berm irrigation, the specific adaptation of a Minnesota variety to Colorado altitude. She did not lecture. She let the trees speak. Most of the orchardists who came to see her drew the wrong conclusions. They saw the specialized techniques and the hand-built infrastructure. And they saw something that only Nadine Pratt could replicate on Nadine Pratt's specific property. And they went home believing that. Ones who drew the right conclusions were mostly younger growers, people under 45, people who were not yet locked into the fruit distribution system that required uniformity and shelf life above all other qualities, and who could see that Nadine was growing something that system could never produce. 2 of them, a woman in Florence and a man in Westcliff, planted Honeycrisp orchards in 1972 and 1974 at altitudes nobody had tested before. Their neighbors shook their heads the way they had shaken their heads at Nadine. Let me tell you about the summer of 1980, because this is where 20 years of quiet, patient work met a test that nobody in Colorado's agricultural community had been tracking, and most of the commercial operations failed. The summer of 1980 came in hot and stayed hot, not dramatically hot, not record-setting in a way that made headlines, just relentlessly, consistently hot and dry from June through September, in a way that accumulated into disaster for anyone growing apples in the lowland orchards of the western slope. The temperature in the Grand Valley climbed above 95 degrees for 31 consecutive days in July and August. The irrigation water from the Colorado River was allocated first to municipal use. What was left for the orchards was not enough. Delicious apples, and golden delicious apples, and Rome apples that had been produced in the Grand Valley for 60 years baked on their branches. The sugar content crashed. The texture went to mush. The commercial buyers who came through in September offered prices so low that several operations could not cover their harvest labor and let the fruit drop unpicked. On. Elbert County that summer was dry, hot. The same southwest wind that was devastating the Grand Valley was blowing through Kiowa and drying the pastures and causing Warren to consider selling down the cattle herd. Capital. But the apple orchard on the south slope below the windbreak was not baking. It was performing exactly as Howard Goss's logic and Nadine's research had predicted it would. Calon. The altitude dropped the temperature 12 to 15 degrees below what the Grand Valley was recording. The nights were still cold. The deep clay subsoil, amended over 19 years with the compost Nadine had been building since 1961, held moisture at a depth the summer heat could not reach. The trees, adapted through 2 decades of Elbert County conditions, were not stressed in the way a lowland tree was stressed. $100. In September of 1980, while the Grand Valley orchards were pricing their losses, Nadine Pratt harvested 4,200 pounds of Honeycrisp apples from her 31 trees, the best crop she had ever produced, with sugar content and texture that her restaurant buyers in Colorado Springs and Denver described in terms that made one of the food writers from the Denver Post drive out to Kiowa to understand what was happening. She was 57 years old that harvest. She had been growing Honeycrisp apples at 5,400 feet in Elbert County for 19 years. She had started with 8 trees a nursery was going to burn. The Denver Post reporter asked her how she had managed it when every commercial orchard on the western slope was failing. Nadine said, "My father kept records from the Swiss Alps that said altitude concentrates flavor. I believed him." He's on. Then she asked the reporter if he wanted to see the root cellar. Let me tell you how it ends, because the ending is the part Howard Goss would have understood without explanation. Nadine ran the orchard until 1994 when she was 71. She handed it to her daughter Clara, who had spent every harvest season on the property since she was 9 years old, and who had studied horticulture at Colorado State specifically so she would understand what her mother had built well enough to continue it. Clara runs the orchard today. The Honeycrisp trees are still there. The original 2 survivors from 1961, still bearing fruit 60 years after Gerald in Pueblo was going to burn their siblings, are the oldest documented Honeycrisp trees at high altitude in Colorado. The compost system Nadine built in 1959 is in its 65th year. Clara added her first independent soil amendment entry to the ledger on April 1, 1995. The South Slope orchard in 2001, the last year Nadine personally walked every row, produced apples that a food scientist at Colorado State, who had been studying altitude effects on fruit quality for a decade, said had flavor complexity that no lowland commercial orchard could replicate under any growing conditions. She had documented it in a paper. Goss had said the same thing in a letter to a grower in Vermont in 1941. It was in the 3rd drawer of Nadine's kitchen desk. In 2003, the Colorado Fruit Growers Association invited Nadine to speak at their annual meeting in Grand Junction. She was 80 years old and had never addressed a professional organization in her life. She thought about declining. Clara drove her to Grand Junction. $100 on. Nadine stood at the podium and looked out at a room full of commercial orchardists, most of whom were still recovering financially from 1980 and had spent 20 years watching the specialty fruit market develop in ways that their operations could not serve. She had 1 page of notes. She read the first 2 lines and then folded the page and put it in her jacket pocket. People ask me how I grew apples at 5,400 feet when the extension service said it couldn't be done. That is the wrong question. The question is why you decided altitude was an obstacle instead of an asset. She paused. The Swiss have been growing apples in the Alps since the 12th century. The Chileans have been growing stone fruit in the Andes since before Columbus arrived. Every high-altitude agricultural culture in the world figured out that cold nights and intense sun and dry air do not ruin fruit. They build flavor that warm, wet, lowland conditions can never achieve. Americans decided sometime around 1920 that agriculture meant flat land and irrigation and uniformity for distribution, and then we decided it, and then we started teaching it in the extension service as though it were a fact of nature. It is not a fact of nature. It is a distribution system's preference, and it is the most expensive preference in American specialty agriculture. First, she paused again. In 1980, the Grand Valley lost a third of its commercial crop to a summer that was not even a historically severe one. My orchard had its best year, not because my land was better. My land is 300 acres of clay and cattle country in Elbert County. I had 19 years of altitude-adapted trees and compost that went down 2 feet, and a Minnesota variety that was bred specifically for conditions everyone in this room was taught to consider a handicap. She stepped back from the podium. The room was quiet for a long moment. To me, the woman from Florence who had planted her own Honeycrisp orchard in 1972 was there. She was 64, still farming, still selling to restaurants and specialty grocers at prices that made the conventional orchardists in the room look at their operating numbers and feel a quiet, specific discomfort. She had come through 1980 the same way Nadine had. She had never told the Fremont County Orchardists Association that the altitude was the reason, because she had learned from watching Nadine that some knowledge travels best by example. After the meeting, she found Nadine in the parking lot. $62, she said, for trees they were going to burn. Nadine looked at her. 48 trees and nobody believed you. 8 trees and Gerald thought I was confused. You knew in 1961 what you were doing. I knew what my father had written down in 1941. I just believed it long enough. And the woman nodded slowly. You for 11 years before I planted mine. I thought you should know that. Dean smiled. That is how it works. One grower at a time, one summer that tests everyone at once. And she looked back at the building where the meeting had been held. Through the windows you could see the orchardists still inside, standing in small groups, talking. Some of them were writing things down. Let me ask you something. What do you see when you drive past a piece of rocky, clay-heavy ground on a south-facing slope at 5,000 feet? Most people see poor farmland. People see something the bank won't finance and the extension agent won't endorse. They see a liability. Nadine pulled her jacket against the September evening. Goss saw a Swiss Alp. He saw the Andes. He saw 20 degrees of cold nights concentrating sugar into fruit that nobody in a warehouse in New Jersey had ever tasted. He saw something that the distribution system would always be too slow to understand and too rigid to value. You see the same thing now, the woman said. You didn't in 1972. No, but I watched you for 11 years and I saw it by then, and that was enough. Dean nodded. That is how it works. She got in the truck. Clara drove her home on the same 2-lane road that Nadine had driven to Pueblo in 1961. The same distance, the same direction, $62, and 8 bareroot trees going the other way in a different truck in a different decade, but the same idea. What do you see when you look at 12 experimental seedlings in a cold storage bay in a nursery that has already decided they are worthless? The nursery manager saw a disposal problem. The Henderson family saw someone else's mistake. Gerald saw burlap and dead wood by February. Elbert County saw a cattle rancher making a decision that had nothing to do with cattle. Dean Pratt saw her father's handwriting in a ledger from 1941. She saw 20 years of Swiss alpine data and Chilean highland records and Upper Rhone trial reports that said altitude was not the enemy. She saw $62 and a south-facing slope and the particular patience of a woman who had grown up watching her father prove things slowly, one season at a time, $40 on, against the confident certainty of people who had never bothered to check whether what they believed was true. She paid $62 for trees a nursery was going to burn. She planted them on ground that every neighbor and every extension agent said was wrong for the purpose. She grew apples at 400 feet in Elbert County for 33 years and handed her daughter an orchard producing fruit that food scientists would eventually write papers about and chefs would drive 3 hours to buy. He said you couldn't grow commercial apples at that altitude in Colorado. Nadine grew them. He's on. And when the summer of 1980 finally came, not a record heat wave, not a disaster with a name, just a long, relentless summer that tested every orchard in the state at once, they understood what Nadine had known since she first read her father's correspondence files. That the conditions everyone was taught to fear were the conditions that built the thing nobody else could grow. 4,000, a south-facing slope, 8 bareroot trees, a rancher's daughter who read the right papers and believed them long enough for the trees to prove it. Get on. I keep thinking about Gerald at the nursery in Pueblo, standing in that cold storage bay in 1961, looking at 12 bareroot trees he had already decided were worthless. He was not a bad man. He was a practical man. He looked at the situation and drew the most reasonable conclusion available to him. Wrong variety, wrong buyer, wrong county, burn them and move on. What strikes me is not that he was wrong, $100 on. It's that he never considered the possibility that he didn't have enough information to be right. Nadine had information he didn't have, not secret information. Not proprietary data locked in a laboratory somewhere. She had her father's ledgers, sitting in the third drawer of a kitchen desk in Kiowa. She had letters from Swiss alpine growers written in the 1930s, $40 on. She had trial reports from Chilean highland orchardists that Howard Goss had tracked down through correspondence over 30 years of patient, deliberate curiosity. To me, the information was available to anyone willing to look for it, in places that weren't obvious. Gerald never looked. Most people never look. They already know what they know, and what they know tells them the trees should burn. I find myself returning to, thinking about Nadine's story, is the relationship between knowing something and being willing to stake years of your life on it. $40. There's a distance between those two things that most people never cross. 100 on. Nadine crossed it in October of 1961 when she drove a truck full of bareroot trees down a 2-lane road to a south-facing slope that every neighbor and extension agent had already written off. She crossed it again every spring for 19 years when the trees leafed out and the late frost threatened, and the clay soil did whatever it was going to do. That kind of staying power is not stubbornness. It's something closer to a moral commitment. A decision that what you know to be true deserves to be tested honestly, completely, for as long as it takes, regardless of what the feed store thinks about it. 1980 summer was the test. Not a test Nadine designed. Not a test she asked for, just the world doing what it does. Applying equal pressure to every orchard in the state at once and letting the results sort themselves out. The Grand Valley operations failed not because they were careless or lazy. $300 on. They failed because they had built their entire operations around a set of assumptions that a single difficult summer could dismantle. $300 on. Nadine's orchard held because she had spent 19 years building something that didn't depend on conditions staying comfortable. I think about what that takes. The intelligence to read widely and think carefully and connect information across decades and continents. the integrity to act on what you've concluded even when no one around you validates the conclusion, and the endurance to keep showing up, season after season, when the proof is still years away and the neighbors are still politely certain you're wrong. When Howard Goss had it, he built it into his daughter through 30 years of ledger-keeping and letter-writing and quiet, methodical observation. Nadine carried it forward for another 33 years and handed it to Clara, who is carrying it still. The trees Gerald was going to burn in 1961 are still producing fruit in Elbert County. That's the answer to a question most people never thought to ask.